Some places do not stay empty because people forgot them. Some places stay empty because something inside remembers. The storm arrived over Black Hollow Valley just after sunset, rolling across the frozen fields like a living thing searching for shelter. Snow swept sideways through the dead corn stalks, and the wind carried the deep wooden groan of old structures surrendering to another hard winter night. Ethan Mercer pulled his coat tighter around his chest as he walked along the narrow county road, his boots sinking into slush that soaked through the cracked leather. Beside him moved Ranger, the 6-year-old German shepherd whose silver-gray coat shimmered beneath the weak glow of distant power lines. The dog's ears stayed alert despite the exhaustion in his heavy steps. They had walked nearly 11 miles since morning after the engine in Ethan's old pickup finally died outside a gas station 2 towns back. The truck had been the last thing Ethan truly owned. Now even that sat abandoned beneath a layer of gathering snow somewhere behind them. Ethan stopped near a rusted mailbox half buried in ice and looked toward the horizon. Through the storm he saw the outline of a massive barn standing alone beyond an open pasture. Its roof sagged beneath years of neglect, and one side leaned slightly as though the wind itself had been slowly pushing it toward the earth. A broken weather vane creaked above the roofline with each icy gust. Ranger suddenly froze beside him. The dog's amber eyes locked onto the barn. Not curious. Focused. Ethan noticed the change immediately. Ranger had worked military search and rescue overseas before becoming his companion. The dog never reacted without reason. "You hear something, boy?" Ethan asked softly. Ranger did not move. Snow gathered along the dog's back while the storm howled through the valley. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, Ranger let out a low breath through his nose and began walking toward the barn. Ethan followed. The closer they came, the stranger the place felt. The field surrounding the structure sat untouched beneath the snow, smooth and pale like no footsteps had crossed it in years. The silence around the barn felt wrong somehow. The wind still screamed across the valley, yet near the structure the sound became muffled, swallowed by the darkness surrounding the old wood walls. Ethan climbed the fence carefully and approached the sliding barn door. One rusted chain hung loose from the handle. Someone had cut it years ago. He pulled the heavy door open just enough to slip inside. The smell hit him first. Old cedar. Dust. Cold iron. Beneath it all lingered another scent almost hidden beneath the years. Smoke. As if someone had once lived there long enough for the walls to remember. Ranger stepped inside slowly, nails clicking across the warped floorboards. The beam of Ethan's flashlight swept across abandoned farming tools, broken stalls, and thick cobwebs hanging from ceiling rafters nearly 30 feet overhead. Snow drifted through cracks in the walls and dissolved silently on the floor. "Not perfect," Ethan murmured, dropping his worn backpack beside a stack of hay bales. "But it'll keep us alive till morning." Ranger did not respond the way he usually did. The dog continued staring deeper into the barn, ears twitching toward the darkness beyond the old horse stalls. Ethan removed his gloves and rubbed warmth back into his stiff hands. His body ached from weeks of sleeping outdoors. Some nights he could still hear Afghanistan in his dreams. The distant ringing. The heavy silence afterward. He tried not to think about those memories anymore. Ranger suddenly growled. Low. Controlled. Not fear. Recognition. Ethan looked up immediately. The dog stood completely still near the center of the barn floor, staring downward at the wooden planks beneath his paws. Then came the sound. Thump. Ethan froze. A single heavy knock echoed from somewhere below the floorboards. The sound did not come again right away, and somehow that made the silence worse. Ethan remained frozen beside the hay bales, one hand gripping the flashlight while Ranger stood over the warped floorboards with his body tense and rigid. Snow hissed softly against the barn walls outside, but inside the air had become unnaturally still, as though the entire structure was listening with them. Ranger lowered his head closer to the floor and inhaled slowly. Then the dog gave another low growl deep in his chest. Ethan stepped forward carefully, his boots creaking across the old wood. "Easy, boy," he whispered, though his own voice sounded strange in the darkness, quieter than usual, almost swallowed by the barn itself. He swept the flashlight downward. The floorboards beneath Ranger looked older than the rest. Darker. The nails were black with rust, and faint gaps between the planks revealed only darkness below. Ethan crouched and pressed his palm against the wood. Cold. Much colder than the rest of the floor. Another sound drifted upward beneath his hand. Not a knock this time. A faint vibration. Rhythmic. Almost like distant machinery turning somewhere underground. Ranger backed away one step, ears pinned slightly backward now. Ethan had seen that reaction before during his deployment overseas. It was the same look Ranger gave before hidden danger revealed itself. The dog-trusted instincts humans no longer remembered how to hear. Ethan slowly stood again and scanned the barn with his flashlight. Dust floated through the beam like pale smoke. The horse stalls lining the far wall leaned crooked beneath decades of neglect. Rusted chains swayed gently overhead though no wind entered the building. Then Ethan noticed something strange near the back corner beside an old feed cabinet. Footprints. Not fresh. But preserved in the dust. Large boot prints leading toward the center of the barn and stopping abruptly near where Ranger stood now. No returning tracks. Ethan felt a chill move slowly through his chest. Someone was here, he murmured softly. Ranger suddenly turned toward the far end of the barn and barked once. Sharp. Urgent. Ethan followed the direction immediately. At first he saw nothing except darkness between support beams. Then lightning flashed faintly outside, illuminating a faded symbol painted high across the wood wall near the ceiling. A white circle. Inside it sat a black number 14. Ethan frowned. Military storage markings. Very old ones. His combat engineer training stirred memories he had not touched in years. Temporary underground depots. Emergency supply. Shelters. Hidden bunkers built beneath civilian structures during the Cold War. His heartbeat slowed into that old soldier rhythm he hated remembering. Calm. Focused. Listening. Another vibration rolled through the floor. Stronger this time. Somewhere beneath the barn came a metallic clank followed by what sounded almost like gears slowly shifting after years of silence. Ranger returned to Ethan's side immediately, pressing close against his leg without taking his eyes off the floorboards. The dog's breathing had changed. Shorter now. Focused. Ethan reached down and rested a hand against Ranger's neck. The shepherd's fur felt cold despite the shelter around them. You knew something was here the second we walked in, Ethan whispered. Ranger blinked slowly but did not relax. Outside, the storm intensified. Wind slammed against the barn walls hard enough to shake dust from the rafters overhead. Somewhere in the darkness an old pulley squealed softly. Then suddenly every sound stopped. Completely. The wind vanished. The chains overhead stopped moving. Even the storm outside seemed to disappear beneath an impossible silence that settled over the barn like a heavy blanket. Ethan looked toward the broken windows. Snow still fell beyond the glass, but no sound entered the room anymore. Ranger stiffened beside him. Then, from directly beneath the floorboards, 3 heavy knocks echoed upward through the wood. Boom. 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 The final knock faded slowly into the wood beneath Ethan's boots, but the vibration remained, humming through the floorboards like a hidden heartbeat buried deep under the frozen earth. Ranger stepped backward another pace, muscles tight beneath his thick coat, amber eyes fixed on the same dark spot near the center of the barn. Ethan could feel the old instincts returning now, the quiet calculations he had spent years trying to leave behind after the war. Measure the sound. Study the structure. Find the hidden thing before it finds you first. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and moved closer again. The beam trembled slightly across the floor, catching decades of scratches and stains pressed into the old wood. Then he noticed something he had missed before. A narrow metal seam hidden between the planks. Almost invisible beneath layers of dirt and age. Not natural. Deliberate. Ethan knelt slowly and brushed away dust with his glove. Beneath the grime sat a circular iron handle recessed into the floor itself. His pulse slowed. "This was built," he whispered. Ranger gave a soft whine in response, pacing once around the spot before stopping again beside Ethan's shoulder. The dog's nose twitched constantly now, pulling in scents hidden beneath the barn. Cold metal. Damp stone. Oil. And something older. The faint dry scent of paper sealed away from the world for a very long time. Ethan tugged lightly on the iron handle, but nothing moved. Whatever rested beneath the floor had been locked shut for years. He leaned back and scanned the barn again, searching for anything connected to the hidden door. Lightning flickered through the storm outside, and for a brief second the entire structure glowed pale blue. That was when Ethan saw the writing carved into one of the support beams near the wall. The letters had almost disappeared beneath time. "Stay out after midnight." The word sent a strange chill through him. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The kind soldiers felt when stepping into abandoned places where stories had been left unfinished. Ranger suddenly turned toward the barn entrance and barked sharply. Ethan spun around immediately. Through the cracked opening of the sliding door he saw headlights approaching slowly across the snowy field. An old truck crawled through the storm before stopping near the fence line. The engine idled roughly for a moment before shutting off. A tall elderly man stepped out wearing a heavy brown coat and carrying a lantern that glowed gold against the swirling snow. Ethan stood carefully as the old man approached the barn entrance without hurry. His face looked weathered like old leather left beneath too many winters, and his pale gray eyes settled first on Ranger before moving toward Ethan. "You should not stay here tonight," the old man said quietly. His voice carried the calm heaviness of someone who had repeated the same warning many times before. Ethan glanced back. Toward the hidden handle beneath the floorboards. "This your property?" The man shook his head once. "Not anymore." Snow drifted across the doorway behind him while the lantern light flickered softly against the walls. "Folks around Black Hollow stopped coming here 40 years ago." Ethan studied him carefully. "Because of what is under the barn?" For the first time the old man's expression shifted slightly. Not surprise. Sadness. He stepped inside slowly, boots creaking against the ancient wood. Ranger watched him closely but did not growl. The old man lowered the lantern near one of the horse stalls, and warm light spilled across the floorboards. "A good dog knows when the earth is remembering," he murmured softly. Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" The old man looked toward the hidden seam in the floor. His eyes darkened with distant memory. "It means," he said quietly, "that something below us has been waiting a very long time for someone to come back." Then somewhere beneath the barn, deep below the frozen ground, metal gears groaned loudly for the first time in decades. The sound beneath the barn rolled upward again, deeper this time, like giant iron wheels turning somewhere far below the frozen ground. Dust drifted from the rafters overhead while the old support beams groaned softly around them. Ethan stared at the floor as the hidden seam widened by less than an inch. Cold air escaped through the crack carrying the scent of stone, oil, and something strangely clean beneath the decay. Not death. Not rot. Preservation. The old man remained perfectly still beside the lantern, his weathered face pale beneath the trembling light. Ranger stepped between Ethan and the opening instinctively, body lowered, ears rigid, every muscle prepared for something unseen. "What is this place?" Ethan asked quietly. The old man exhaled slowly through his nose. "Back during the winter of 1958, the government built emergency shelters all through these valleys. Most were abandoned before they were finished. But this one, his voice faded as another metallic groan echoed beneath their feet. This one was never truly empty. Snow swirled through the broken gaps in the barn walls, but somehow the cold no longer felt like it belonged to the storm outside. It felt older now. Buried. Ethan crouched again beside the hidden handle and brushed more dirt away with his glove. He uncovered a faded military insignia stamped into the iron. An eagle inside a shield. Army Corps of Engineers. His chest tightened immediately. He had worn that symbol himself years ago overseas. Why would engineers build something beneath a farm, he asked. The old man stared at the floor for a long moment before answering. Because nobody looks for secrets under places that feel forgotten. Ranger suddenly growled low again and stepped backward. The hidden seam beneath the floor shifted another inch with a loud mechanical click. Ethan rose quickly as several locks disengaged below them one by one. Heavy. Ancient. Deliberate. The old man grabbed Ethan's arm before he could step closer. His hand felt cold as frozen wood. Listen carefully, he said quietly. If that door opens tonight, it means the system finally found what it was waiting for. Ethan frowned. What system? But before the old man could answer, the lantern flame flickered violently. The air pressure inside the barn changed instantly. Ethan felt it in his ears first, a low deep hum rising from beneath the earth itself. Then the entire floor trembled. Ranger barked sharply and moved back toward the entrance, claws scraping against the wood. Somewhere below them, hidden machinery roared awake after decades of silence. Ethan's flashlight flickered once. Twice. Then steadied again. The seam in the floor suddenly split wider with a thunderous crack. Wooden planks shifted apart in perfect symmetry as hidden gears turned beneath them. Dust exploded upward into the lantern light. Ethan stumbled back instinctively while Ranger barked continuously now, the sound echoing wildly through the barn. Slowly, impossibly, a rectangular section of the floor began lowering into darkness like an elevator descending into the earth. Cold air rushed upward from below carrying the faint scent of damp concrete and machine oil untouched for generations. Ethan stepped closer despite himself. His heartbeat had slowed. Into that dangerous calm soldiers knew too well, the calm that arrived right before something life-changing revealed itself. 20 feet below the barn floor, dim yellow lights flickered alive one after another deep inside the hidden chamber. The glow rose slowly through the darkness like ghosts waking beneath the earth. Ethan could now see the top of a metal staircase descending far underground. Perfectly preserved. Untouched by time. Ranger stopped barking suddenly. The shepherd stood frozen beside Ethan, staring downward into the opening with wide unblinking eyes. Then the dog gave a soft uneasy whine Ethan had never heard before. Not fear. Recognition. The old man removed his hat slowly, his expression heavy with memory. 40 years ago, he whispered, a soldier walked down those stairs during a snowstorm and never came back out. Then, from somewhere deep below the hidden staircase, a single overhead light flickered on by itself. The light below flickered weakly at first, casting long trembling shadows across the metal staircase hidden beneath the barn floor. Ethan stared downward into the opening while cold air rose steadily from the underground chamber, curling through the darkness like the breath of something sleeping beneath the earth. Ranger remained perfectly still beside him, ears forward, eyes locked on the stairwell. The dog no longer growled now. Somehow that unsettled Ethan more than the noise had. Who was the soldier? Ethan asked quietly without taking his eyes off the opening. The old man lowered himself slowly onto an overturned wooden crate near the wall. For a moment he looked much older than before, as though the memories inside the barn carried weight heavier than winter itself. His name was Walter Grayson, he said softly. Army engineer. Same division as your insignia. Ethan glanced back at him sharply. You knew him? The old man nodded once. Everyone in Black Hollow knew him back then. Walter helped build this place during the Cold War. Said it was designed to protect people if the world ever lost its mind. Snow drifted softly through cracks in the roof overhead while the lantern light danced across the ancient beams. Ethan looked again toward the hidden staircase disappearing underground. What happened to him? The old man's eyes moved slowly toward the darkness below. One night during a storm almost exactly like this one, the lights beneath the barn turned on by themselves. Walter came out here carrying a military radio and walked down those stairs alone. He paused quietly. Nobody ever saw him again. Silence settled heavily inside the barn. Ethan felt it pressing against the walls, against the rafters, against the hidden chamber beneath them. Ranger suddenly stepped forward toward the staircase before stopping at the edge of the opening. The shepherd sniffed the cold air carefully, then looked back at Ethan. Waiting. Ethan knew that look well. Ranger was asking for permission. His pulse tightened slowly in his chest. He should have walked away. Any reasonable man would have. But Ethan had spent years surviving by following instincts most people ignored. And something deep beneath the barn was pulling at those instincts now like a distant voice carried through snow. He grabbed the flashlight from his pack and tightened the straps on his coat. "You do not have to go down there," the old man said quietly. Ethan looked toward him. Maybe not. He glanced at Ranger. But somebody built this place for a reason. The old man stared at him for several long seconds before reaching into his coat pocket. He removed a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag marked with the number 14. "Walter left this with me the week before he disappeared," he whispered. "Said I would know who to give it to someday." Ethan hesitated before accepting the key. The metal felt strangely warm despite the freezing air around them. Ranger moved first. The German shepherd stepped carefully onto the metal staircase, his claws clicking softly against the steel steps as he descended into the underground darkness. Ethan followed immediately behind him. The deeper they moved below the barn, the warmer the air became. Not warm like a furnace. Warm like hidden machinery still quietly breathing after decades underground. Their footsteps echoed softly through the chamber while old overhead lights flickered awake one section at a time farther down the corridor ahead. Concrete walls stretched beneath the earth reinforced with steel beams untouched by rust. Dust coated the floor in thick layers except for one narrow path leading deeper inside. Ethan stopped suddenly halfway down the stairs. Ranger had frozen again. The dog stared toward the corridor below with wide alert eyes. Ethan slowly raised the flashlight beam toward the concrete floor. Fresh footprints crossed through the dust ahead of them. Large boot prints. Recent enough to still hold sharp edges. Ethan's heartbeat slowed instantly. Someone else had already been down there. The underground corridor stretched beneath the frozen valley like a forgotten artery buried inside the earth. Ethan stood motionless near the bottom of the staircase while Ranger stared at the fresh boot prints crossing through the dust ahead of them. The prints moved deeper into the bunker corridor and disappeared around a distant concrete corner where weak overhead lights flickered softly against steel walls. Ethan crouched carefully and touched one of the tracks with his gloved fingers. The edges remained sharp. Whoever made them had not passed through long ago. "Not possible," he whispered beneath his breath. "Dust this thick should have remained untouched for decades." Ranger lowered his nose closer to the floor and inhaled slowly. Then the shepherd looked deeper into the corridor and released a low uneasy rumble. Ethan stood again, flashlight trembling faintly across the walls. The bunker felt impossibly preserved. Old military signs still hung above sealed steel doors. Emergency power. Water filtration. Storage bay C. The paint had faded but remained readable beneath the dust. Somewhere far below them machinery continued humming softly through the concrete like the bunker itself still possessed a heartbeat. Ethan followed the footprints cautiously. Ranger moved ahead now with slow deliberate steps, every muscle alert beneath his thick coat. Their footsteps echoed hollow against the corridor floor while old fluorescent lights buzzed weakly overhead one section at a time. The deeper they walked, the stranger the silence became. No dripping water. No shifting pipes. Just the distant mechanical pulse moving somewhere beneath the bunker walls. Ethan passed a large observation window coated with grime. He stopped and wiped part of the glass clean with his sleeve. Inside rested an enormous underground room lined with shelves stacked floor to ceiling with old crates stamped U.S. Army Engineering Division. Some crates had burst open over the years revealing coils of copper wire, sealed radios, survival rations, and stacks of yellowed maps preserved inside plastic wrapping. It looked less like abandoned storage and more like a place waiting for instructions that never came. Ranger suddenly barked once and moved farther ahead. Ethan followed quickly around the corridor corner and froze. A door stood partially open at the far end of the hall. Warm light glowed faintly from inside the room beyond. Not electric white like the bunker lights. Golden. Softer. Like lamplight. Ethan felt the hairs rise slowly along the back of his neck. Someone had been there recently. He approached carefully while Ranger slowed near the doorway. The dog sniffed the air once and then stepped inside without hesitation. Ethan raised the flashlight and followed. The room beyond looked untouched by time. A small desk sat beneath a glowing lantern. Dust covered most surfaces except for one narrow path leading toward the back wall. Old military jackets still hung neatly from hooks. A coffee mug rested beside a stack of papers as though someone had stepped away only moments ago. Ethan's flashlight beam drifted toward the far corner where a small record player sat beside shelves of carefully organized books. The room carried the faint scent of cedar wood and old paper instead of decay. Then Ethan noticed the clock hanging above the desk. It was still ticking softly. Tick. 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 He stared at it in disbelief. That is impossible. Ranger approached the desk slowly and sniffed at a leather-bound journal lying open beside the lamp. Ethan stepped closer and saw handwriting across the page. Fresh ink. His pulse tightened immediately. The final line read, "If the lights turned on again tonight, it means he finally came back." Ethan's breathing slowed. The words felt less like a note and more like a message waiting specifically for him. Before he could touch the journal, the old bunker speakers crackled somewhere overhead. Static hissed softly through the corridor outside. Then a weak trembling voice echoed through the underground chamber for the first time in decades. "Walter, if you can hear this, do not let them open the lower gate." Ranger's ears snapped upward instantly. Ethan turned slowly toward the dark hallway outside as the voice dissolved back into static. Then somewhere deep below the bunker, another heavy metal door unlocked with a thunderous mechanical boom. The sound of the unlocking door echoed through the bunker like distant thunder rolling beneath the earth. Ethan stood motionless beside the desk while the old speaker overhead crackled one final burst of static before falling silent again. Ranger moved toward the hallway immediately, ears high, paws careful against the dusty concrete floor. The shepherd's breathing had become slower now, focused in the way it always did whenever he sensed something important rather than dangerous. Ethan grabbed the leather journal from the desk and opened it carefully beneath the lantern light. Most of the pages contained engineering notes, power schedules, water reserve calculations, and lists of names written decades earlier. But toward the back, the entries changed. The handwriting became shakier. More personal. December 11, 1958. The lower gate should never have been connected to the system. They said it was for national security, but something beneath Black Hollow was already here long before we arrived. Ethan frowned as he turned another page. December 18, 1958. The vibrations are growing stronger at night. The dogs hear it before anyone else. Ranger suddenly stopped near the corridor entrance and stared toward the darkness ahead. Ethan looked up from the journal. "What is it, boy?" The dog did not bark. He simply stood there listening. Ethan could hear it now too. Faint footsteps somewhere deep below the bunker. Slow. Uneven. Not approaching. Circling. He set the journal beneath his arm and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The bunker lights overhead flickered softly as if struggling to stay awake after half a century underground. Dust drifted through the stale air while the low mechanical hum continued pulsing beneath the concrete walls. Ethan followed Ranger deeper into the facility. The fresh boot prints continued ahead of them through the dust, leading toward a large steel blast door marked Lower Access Gate 14. Thick frost clung to the edges of the enormous door despite the warmer air underground. Beside it sat an old security panel glowing faint green. Still active. Ethan stopped several feet away. This place should not have power, he whispered. Ranger moved toward the blast door and sniffed carefully along the base before stepping back uneasily. Then Ethan noticed another detail. The boot prints ended directly in front of the sealed door. No returning tracks. His pulse tightened again. Whoever came through the bunker had reached this spot and simply vanished. Ethan slowly inserted the brass key the old man had given him into the security panel. The green light immediately brightened. Somewhere inside the bunker, hidden generators roared louder beneath the earth. The panel hissed softly before a faded message flickered onto the dusty screen. Authorized engineer detected. Welcome back, Commander Grayson. Ethan stared at the words in disbelief. That is not possible. Ranger backed away from the door and gave a low uncertain whine. The blast door suddenly released a deep hydraulic sigh. Ancient locking mechanisms disengaged one by one with heavy metallic clanks that echoed through the corridor. Ethan stepped back instinctively as the massive door slowly began sliding open. Cold air rushed outward immediately, colder than the storm above them. But beneath the freezing air came another sensation. Wind. Not artificial ventilation. Real moving wind rising from somewhere deep underground. The opening widened just enough for Ethan's flashlight beam to slip through. He froze instantly. Beyond the blast door stretched not another bunker corridor, but an enormous underground cavern illuminated by rows of dim industrial lights hanging from steel beams overhead. At the center of the cavern sat an entire hidden town buried beneath the valley. Small houses lined narrow streets beneath the rock ceiling. A church steeple rose near the center beside a frozen fountain. Snow covered the rooftops inside the cavern as though winter itself had somehow found its way underground. Ranger stared silently into the hidden town, ears twitching toward the darkness beyond the empty streets. Then, far below them near the frozen church, a porch light turned on by itself. The single porch light glowed softly near the frozen church at the center of the underground town, casting pale gold across the snow-covered street while the rest of the cavern remained silent beneath the stone ceiling overhead. Ethan stood at the edge of the massive blast door unable to speak for several seconds. The hidden town stretched nearly 200 yards across beneath Black Hollow Valley, perfectly preserved beneath the earth like a memory the world had forgotten to bury completely. Small cottages lined narrow streets dusted with pale underground frost. Old telephone poles leaned quietly beside sidewalks untouched by footprints. A diner sign hung crooked above one building, its faded red letters barely visible beneath years of stillness. Ranger stepped cautiously through the doorway first, his claws clicking softly against the icy concrete ramp descending toward the underground streets. Ethan followed slowly behind him, flashlight sweeping across the impossible scene. The deeper they entered the cavern, the more real the town became. Wind moved softly through the hidden streets though no sky existed above them. Ethan could hear it whispering through porch railings and frozen tree branches planted decades earlier beneath artificial lamps mounted high against the cavern walls. It felt less like a bunker and more like a place abandoned in the middle of ordinary life. The porch light near the church flickered once. Ranger froze immediately and stared toward it. Ethan felt the same sensation return again, that strange pull beneath his ribs like the town itself recognized him somehow. He tightened his coat against the cold and continued down the icy road toward the center of the cavern. As they passed the old diner, Ethan looked through the dusty windows and stopped. Inside sat plates still resting on tables beside faded coffee cups. A jukebox stood dark in the corner beside Christmas decorations hanging from the ceiling. A calendar remained pinned behind the counter. December 24, 1958. Ethan swallowed slowly. It looked as though the entire town had simply paused one winter evening and never started moving again. Ranger walked ahead toward the church while his ears twitched constantly toward sounds Ethan could not hear. Somewhere deeper inside the cavern came faint electrical hums and distant mechanical clicks echoing through the rock. Yet beneath those sounds lingered something softer. Music. Ethan stopped and listened carefully. A faint piano melody drifted through the underground streets. Slow. Gentle. Almost swallowed by the wind. Ranger barked once toward the church entrance. The front doors stood slightly open now. Ethan could have sworn they were closed moments earlier. Snowflakes drifted softly across the church steps though there was no storm underground. The air around the building felt colder than the rest of the cavern, and the stained glass windows reflected dim golden light onto the frozen street. Ethan climbed the steps slowly while Ranger entered first. Inside, rows of wooden pews faced a small altar beneath flickering candlelight. Dust covered everything except a narrow path leading down the center aisle toward the front. The piano melody stopped the second Ethan stepped inside. Silence settled heavily through the sanctuary. Then he noticed the candles. Real flames. Freshly burning. Ethan's pulse tightened. Someone had lit them recently. Ranger moved toward the altar and sniffed carefully along the floorboards before stopping beside a small wooden box resting near the pulpit. Ethan approached slowly and opened it. Inside rested another journal wrapped carefully in cloth beside an old photograph. Ethan lifted the photo toward the candlelight. His breath caught immediately. The picture showed a group of Army engineers standing in front of the barn decades earlier. Walter Grayson stood among them smiling faintly. Beneath falling snow. Beside him stood another man Ethan recognized instantly despite the years. The old man upstairs. But it was the figure at the far edge of the photo that made Ethan's blood run cold. A younger version of himself stared back from the photograph. Same gray-blue eyes. Same scar near the jaw. Same face. Ethan whispered softly into the silence. That is impossible. Then somewhere behind the altar, a floorboard creaked. The creak behind the altar came slowly, like old wood shifting beneath careful weight. Ethan turned immediately, flashlight snapping toward the darkness beyond the pulpit while Ranger moved in front of him with a low protective growl rumbling through his chest. The candle flames flickered softly against the church walls, casting long shadows across the empty pews. For several seconds nothing moved. Then another floorboard groaned somewhere behind the altar. Not loud. Intentional. Ethan stepped forward carefully, boots echoing against the worn wooden floor while the old photograph remained clutched tightly in his hand. He could still feel the shock of seeing his own face staring back at him from a picture taken decades before he was born. Ranger advanced first toward the rear of the sanctuary where a narrow hallway disappeared behind the choir platform. The dog's ears stayed locked forward, listening beyond the silence. Ethan followed slowly, flashlight cutting through drifting dust particles floating in the stale air. The hallway beyond the altar was narrow and lined with small rooms once used as offices and storage closets. Most stood empty except for stacks of old hymn books and boxes of untouched winter blankets sealed beneath dust. At the far end of the corridor, one door remained partially open. Warm light spilled faintly across the floor beneath it. Ethan felt his pulse slow again into that old combat rhythm. Calm. Sharp. Listening. Ranger approached the door carefully and sniffed once before stepping backward beside Ethan's leg. The shepherd did not bark. He simply watched the doorway with deep uneasy focus. Ethan pushed the door open slowly. Inside sat a small study illuminated by an oil lamp resting on a wooden desk. The room smelled faintly of cedar smoke and old paper. Bookshelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, filled with military journals, engineering manuals, and carefully preserved binders marked classified beneath faded army seals. A kettle sat near a small iron stove still warm enough to steam softly in the cold air. Someone had been there recently. Ethan stepped inside carefully while Ranger remained near the doorway watching the hallway behind them. Then Ethan saw the wall. Dozens of photographs had been pinned carefully across the wooden boards beside the desk. Black Hollow Valley. The barn. Construction crews. Army engineers. Families standing in front of the hidden underground town during Christmas celebrations beneath the cavern lights. Ethan moved closer slowly, flashlight trembling slightly in his grip. Every photograph contained the same man. Walter Grayson. Older in some pictures. Younger in others. But always standing near the center beside another figure whose face remained partly obscured by shadows or torn edges. Ethan's eyes drifted toward the final photograph hanging alone at the center of the wall. His breath caught instantly. It showed Walter standing beside a woman holding a small child in her arms beneath falling snow outside the barn. The woman's face looked strikingly familiar. Ethan felt something tighten painfully in his chest as memories stirred faintly at the edge of his mind. A lullaby. A warm hand brushing his hair. A voice calling his name during winter storms long ago. Ethan stepped closer until he could finally read the faded handwriting beneath the photo. Walter Grayson and Evelyn Mercer. December 1958. Ethan stared at the surname in silence. Mercer. His own name. Ranger suddenly growled low near the doorway. Ethan turned sharply. The oil lamp flame flickered violently as cold wind swept through the study despite the sealed bunker walls. Papers rustled across the desk. Then the old radio resting beside the lamp crackled softly to life. Static hissed through the room before a man's exhausted voice emerged weakly from the speaker. If you are hearing this, then the system chose you too. Ethan stepped slowly toward the radio. The voice continued through bursts of static. Older now. Fragile. Walter was not protecting the town from what was below us. A long pause followed. Ranger's ears flattened backward as the bunker lights dimmed overhead. Then the voice whispered one final sentence that sent cold fear through Ethan's chest. He was protecting the world from what the town became. At that exact moment, every light inside the underground cavern suddenly went dark. Darkness swallowed the underground town all at once. The warm glow from the church candles vanished. The distant porch light outside disappeared. Even the soft hum of machinery beneath the cavern floor fell silent, leaving behind a stillness so complete Ethan could hear his own breathing echo inside the study. Ranger pressed tightly against his side with a low warning growl vibrating through the dark. Then somewhere outside the church, a bell rang once. Slow. Hollow. Ancient. Ethan froze immediately. The sound rolled through the underground streets like something carried upward from another century. He raised the flashlight and clicked it on again. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, revealing floating dust and trembling shadows across the bookshelves. The old radio on the desk remained dead now, its speakers silent beneath layers of static. Ethan grabbed the photograph and slipped it carefully into his coat pocket before turning toward the doorway. "We are leaving," he whispered softly to Ranger, though he no longer felt certain the bunker would allow that choice. Ranger stepped into the hallway first. The shepherd's ears remained pinned backward while his eyes moved constantly through the darkness ahead. Ethan followed close behind, flashlight sweeping across the church corridor. Every room now stood completely black and silent. Yet beneath the silence came another sound. Footsteps. Not close. Somewhere outside in the underground streets. Slow footsteps crunching softly across snow. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment and listened carefully. Crunch. Pause. Crunch. Ranger growled deeper now, staring toward the sanctuary entrance at the far end of the hall. Ethan moved cautiously back toward the church. Candle smoke still drifted faintly through the cold air, though the flames themselves had vanished. The sanctuary beyond sat buried in darkness except for pale silver light spilling weakly through the stained glass windows from somewhere outside. Ethan approached the front doors slowly. The footsteps had stopped. He pushed one of the church doors open carefully and stepped outside into the frozen underground town once again. Snow drifted quietly beneath the cavern ceiling. The entire hidden valley now rested beneath pale emergency lights glowing dim red along the streets. Ethan's flashlight beam swept across abandoned storefronts and silent rooftops dusted with frost. Then he saw them. Footprints crossing the snow directly in front of the church. Fresh. Ethan crouched carefully beside the tracks. Large boots. Military issue. The same prints from the bunker corridor. But these were different somehow. The snow beneath them had not melted or shifted naturally. Instead, frost spread outward from each footprint in thin icy veins across the street like the ground itself had frozen around them. Ranger sniffed the tracks once before pulling backward uneasily. Ethan followed the trail with his flashlight. The prints led deeper into town toward a large building near the far side of the cavern where a faded sign still hung above steel doors. Black Hollow Research Facility. The word sent a strange heaviness through Ethan's chest. Research facility. Not shelter. Not bunker. The truth beneath Black Hollow had been changing shape since the moment he entered the barn. Ranger barked once sharply toward the building. Ethan raised the flashlight higher and noticed faint light glowing behind one of the frosted windows near the roofline. Someone was inside. Or something. The underground wind moved softly through the empty streets carrying distant whispers through broken power lines overhead. Ethan could not understand the words, but they sounded almost like voices praying somewhere far beneath the earth. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and began walking toward the research building while Ranger stayed close beside him. As they passed an old frozen fountain near the center of town, Ethan noticed a bronze plaque covered in ice. He wiped part of it clean with his sleeve and felt his stomach tighten immediately. Black Hollow Project. Phase 4. Human Preservation Program. December 1958. Below the inscription sat a list of names. Walter Grayson. Evelyn Mercer. Ethan Mercer. Ethan stared at the final name in silence. Then the light inside the research facility window suddenly moved as though someone had just stepped past it. The light behind the frosted research facility window disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving only dim red emergency lamps glowing across the underground streets. Ethan stood motionless beside the frozen fountain while Ranger stared toward the building with every muscle tightened beneath his silver-gray coat. The hidden town no longer felt abandoned now. It felt aware. The wind moved softly through empty alleyways carrying faint metallic echoes from somewhere deep below the cavern floor. Ethan stepped carefully toward the research facility, boots crunching through thin underground frost while the old plaque remained heavy in his thoughts. His name should not have existed beneath Black Hollow Project records from 1958. Yet there it was carved into bronze decades before he was born. Ranger moved slightly ahead, ears twitching constantly toward sounds Ethan still could not hear clearly. As they approached the facility entrance, Ethan noticed the building itself looked newer than the rest of the underground town. Reinforced concrete walls stretched upward beneath steel support beams disappearing into the cavern ceiling. Thick cables ran along the exterior feeding power into the structure from hidden generators still alive somewhere beneath the valley. Frost coated the dark windows except for one narrow section where warmth had melted the ice from inside. Someone had touched the glass recently. Ethan reached the steel entrance doors and brushed snow from the faded lettering overhead. Research and Preservation Unit 4. The words Preservation Unit stirred something uneasy deep inside him. He had seen language like that before in military briefings overseas. Governments rarely used words like preservation, unless they feared losing something important. Ranger sniffed along the base of the door before stepping back abruptly with a soft, uneasy whine. Ethan noticed it immediately. The dog smelled something familiar. Human scent. Very faint. Old wool. Machine oil. Cedar smoke. The same scent lingering inside the church study. Ethan placed his hand against the steel doors. Warm. The facility still carried heat. Before he could react, the entrance locks clicked softly from inside. The heavy doors slowly opened on their own with a long hydraulic sigh. Warm air drifted outward carrying the scent of paper, coffee, and electricity. Ethan exchanged one quiet look with Ranger before stepping inside. The research facility lobby remained brightly lit beneath flickering fluorescent panels overhead. Desks lined the room covered in maps, old radios, and stacks of carefully preserved files. Coffee mugs still sat beside typewriters as though workers had simply stepped away moments earlier. Ethan's flashlight drifted across a large wall map showing Black Hollow Valley above ground. Beneath it another map revealed the hidden underground town extending far deeper than Ethan had imagined. Multiple levels branched beneath the valley like roots beneath frozen soil. Level 4 sat circled heavily in red ink. Access restricted. Do not open lower chambers. Ethan's heartbeat slowed. Ranger suddenly barked sharply toward the far side of the room. Ethan turned immediately. A reel-to-reel projector near the back wall had switched on by itself. Dust floated through the beam of pale light now illuminating an old white screen hanging from the ceiling. Static flickered across the projection before an image slowly appeared. A man stood before the camera wearing an Army engineering uniform. Walter Grayson. Older than in the photographs now. Exhausted. His eyes carried the hollow weight of someone who had spent too many years listening to things no one else believed existed. If this recording has activated, Walter said quietly into the camera, then the system identified a surviving Mercer descendant. Ethan felt cold spread slowly through his chest. Walter continued speaking while static hissed softly around his voice. Black Hollow was never built to survive war. It was built to survive time. The image flickered briefly before stabilizing again. In 1958, we discovered something beneath this valley. A natural phenomenon buried inside the earth that slowed biological aging within the lower chambers. Ethan stared silently at the screen. Walter lowered his eyes for a moment before continuing. The government wanted control of it. They moved families underground and began preservation trials. Ranger stepped closer to the projector with a low uneasy growl. Walter's face darkened with regret. But the deeper levels changed people over time. Memory distortion. Isolation. Obsession. Some refused to leave. The screen flickered violently. Then Walter leaned closer to the camera and whispered one final warning. If Level 4 reopened tonight, then someone below is awake again. At that exact moment, an elevator bell chimed softly somewhere deeper inside the facility. The elevator bell echoed softly through the research facility like a sound waking from another lifetime. Ethan stood frozen beside the projector screen while Walter Grayson's image dissolved slowly into static behind him. Ranger moved closer immediately, body tense, eyes fixed on the dark hallway leading deeper into the building where the elevator waited somewhere below. The underground facility seemed alive now. Lights flickered overhead in slow, uneven pulses. Air vents whispered softly through the walls. Somewhere beneath the floors, hidden generators rumbled like distant thunder under frozen earth. Ethan swallowed hard and picked up a thick folder resting beside the projector controls. Black Hollow Preservation Program. Level 4 Authorization. Inside were dozens of documents stamped classified beneath faded government seals. Ethan flipped carefully through brittle pages while Ranger kept watch toward the hallway. Medical reports. Biological studies. Sleep monitoring records. Most of the names listed had vanished decades ago. Then Ethan stopped on a single page near the back of the file. Subject, Ethan Mercer. Status, successful transfer. Preservation line continues above. Ground. Ethan stared silently at the words while cold unease spread through his chest. Transfer. Preservation line. He turned another page and found a photograph clipped beneath handwritten notes. A young woman held a newborn baby wrapped in blankets inside the underground church. Evelyn Mercer. Beside her stood Walter Grayson with one hand resting protectively on the child's shoulder. Ethan looked closer at the infant's hospital bracelet. Ethan Mercer. December 24, 1958. His pulse stumbled painfully. None of it made sense. He had childhood memories above ground. Foster homes. Army recruitment. Years of drifting after the war. Yet somewhere beneath Black Hollow, records insisted he had already existed nearly 70 years earlier. Ranger barked sharply toward the hallway. Ethan looked up instantly. The elevator bell chimed again. Closer this time. Then came the slow grinding sound of cables moving far below the facility. The elevator was rising. Ethan stepped carefully toward the corridor while gripping the folder tightly beneath his arm. The hallway lights flickered red now, bathing the concrete walls in dim emergency glow. Frost spread slowly along the floor tiles from somewhere ahead. Ranger lowered his head and growled softly as they approached the elevator corridor. At the far end stood a steel elevator door marked Level 4 Access. A single floor indicator above it glowed faint amber in the darkness. 4, the number remained still for several seconds. Then slowly changed. 3, Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Somewhere below them the elevator continued rising. 2, Ranger backed away slightly, ears pinned flat now. Ethan could hear it clearly at last. Not just machinery. Breathing. Slow human breathing echoing faintly through the elevator shaft. 1, the cables groaned heavily overhead before the elevator finally stopped behind the steel doors with a soft mechanical hiss. Silence followed. Thick. Unnatural. Ethan's flashlight trembled faintly in his hand. Then the elevator doors slowly slid open by themselves. Warm yellow light spilled across the corridor floor. Inside the elevator stood an old man wearing a dark wool coat dusted with snow. His silver hair rested neatly beneath an army engineer cap from another era. His pale gray eyes looked tired but kind. Ethan's chest tightened immediately because he recognized the face from every photograph underground. Walter Grayson stepped quietly out of the elevator and looked directly at Ethan. "You have your mother's eyes," he said softly. Ethan could not speak. Ranger stared at the old man silently without growling now, tail low but calm, as though the shepherd already understood something Ethan did not. Walter glanced toward the research room behind them before lowering his voice. "There is not much time left. The lower chambers are waking up again." Ethan finally forced himself to speak. "Who am I?" Walter's eyes carried the deep sorrow of a man who had protected the same secret for most of his life. "You are the reason Black Hollow survived," he whispered softly. Then somewhere deep beneath Level 4, an enormous metal gate began opening. The sound of the opening gate rolled upward through the underground facility with a force that shook dust from the ceiling tiles and rattled the old fluorescent lights overhead. Ethan stared at Walter Grayson in silence while Ranger stepped protectively between them both and the dark elevator shaft behind. The old engineer looked exhausted beneath the pale emergency glow, like a man who had carried the same burden for far too many winters. Somewhere below Level 4, massive machinery groaned awake after decades of silence. Ethan could feel the vibrations beneath his boots now, deep and rhythmic like the valley itself had begun breathing again. Walter glanced toward the trembling floor before looking back at Ethan. "The preservation field below us was never supposed to stay active this long," he said quietly. "When the government abandoned Black Hollow, we tried shutting everything down. But the lower chambers changed over time. Ethan tightened his grip on the folder beneath his arm. You said I was the reason this place survived. Walter nodded slowly. Because you were the first child born inside the preservation field. The word settled heavily through the corridor. Ethan could barely hear the storm of questions inside his own mind above the low mechanical rumble rising from below. Walter stepped closer carefully. Your mother knew the lower levels were becoming unstable. Memory distortion. Time irregularities. Some people stopped aging normally. Others forgot who they were entirely. His tired eyes darkened with grief. Evelyn refused to let that happen to you. Ethan felt his chest tighten painfully at the sound of her name. Walter continued softly. She took you above ground during the evacuation. We erased every official record tying you to Black Hollow. New identity. Foster system. Fresh life away from the valley. Ranger looked up at Ethan quietly, amber eyes reflecting the flickering lights overhead. Ethan suddenly understood the strange gaps in his memories. The dreams of snow-covered tunnels. Church bells underground. A woman singing softly beside warm lantern light. Fragments of a life hidden beneath decades of silence. Another violent tremor shook the facility. Warning sirens suddenly echoed through the underground town outside. Red emergency lights flashed across the corridor walls while old speakers crackled overhead. Core instability detected. Lower chambers breaching. Walter closed his eyes briefly as though he had hoped never to hear those words again. The preservation field is collapsing, he whispered. Ethan looked toward the elevator shaft where warm air now rushed upward carrying faint whispers from far below. What happens if it fails? Walter met his eyes quietly. Everything preserved underground will begin catching up to time all at once. Silence settled between them for several heavy seconds. Then Ranger barked sharply toward the research room behind them. Ethan turned immediately. The projector had switched back on by itself. Static flickered across the screen before stabilizing into a final image of Evelyn Mercer standing outside the barn beneath falling snow. She smiled softly into the camera while holding a small infant wrapped in blankets. Ethan felt his breath catch painfully in his chest. Evelyn's voice filled the room gently through old speakers worn thin by time. If you are seeing this, Ethan, then it means the valley called you home. The underground sirens continued echoing through the facility while the image flickered softly across the screen. Black Hollow was never meant to preserve life forever, she whispered. Only hope. Tears stung unexpectedly at Ethan's eyes while Ranger rested silently against his leg. Evelyn smiled faintly through the static. Kindness survives longer than fear. That is what your father believed. Walter lowered his head quietly beside him. Then the image began fading. When the lights go out, she whispered softly, follow the dog. The screen turned black. At that exact moment every alarm inside Black Hollow suddenly stopped.